In Minnesota, Democrat Al Franken is ahead of the former incumbent, well, some like to just call him plain former Republican Senator Norm Coleman. Franken's ahead by 312 votes. Way back at the time of the election, it was a different story. As of Wednesday, November 5th, the day after the election, Coleman had a 477 vote lead over Franken. But out of 2.9 million votes, that was a very, very small margin of victory. So that led to the state-mandated hand recount. When that was over, a month later, Mr. Coleman's lead had shrunk down to 192. The recount was accompanied by a series of canvassing board reviews of challenged or previously rejected ballots. When those were counted, a month later still, on January 5th, Franken was ahead by 225. Then Mr. Coleman started suing. That chapter in the never-ending Senate story is still going on. Just yesterday, a three-judge panel hearing the lawsuit counted some more ballots that they ruled had been improperly rejected. So the new count as of today puts Franken a little further ahead, now by 312. There are still some unresolved conflicts in this case, but the court is expected to rule on them all soon, and the ruling is widely expected, frankly, to be in favor of Mr. Franken. Even Mr. Coleman's campaign folks admit as much. At which point we would be moving on to the next stage of this race, which could be an appeal to the Minnesota State Supreme Court. Mr. Coleman's legal team has already vowed to pursue such an appeal if and when Mr. Franken becomes the winner both of the recount and of the legal challenge to the recount. The State Supreme Court, as the name implies, is supreme. It is the highest authority in the state. So once the State Supreme Court rules, it will finally be done, right? Phew. Actually, wait a minute. Norm Coleman is not only promising a state Supreme Court challenge, he's making noises about taking the whole thing federal as well, hinting at a U.S. Supreme Court challenge if he loses again on the state level. Again, making a federal case out of losing a statewide election actually takes some doing. To get to the U.S. Supreme Court, Mr. Coleman would almost certainly have to argue that his rights have been somehow violated by the laborious, systematic recount process. The bottom line, there are two ways for this to end. Either this orderly, unexciting, but sort of understandable state process comes to an end, and with the understanding that every avenue of redress has been pursued, Minnesota's process determines who won that state's election for U.S. Senator, or the Minnesota process is denounced as having somehow violated Norm Coleman's rights, and the whole thing starts all over again in federal court this time. And the people of Minnesota can count on still having only 50% representation in the Senate indefinitely, at least for months. Joining us now is a man who may have the determinative say in whether or not his state gets to have two senators anytime soon. I'm delighted to have as a return guest to the show, Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty. Governor Pawlenty, thank you so much for being here.
Dr. Maddow, it's good to be with you, and of course you've become a very serious student of the Coleman-Franken saga. That's an impressive summary you've just ripped off there.
Did I get the chronology correct at least? It's hard to keep track of.
I did. I'm impressed. You know quite a bit about the case.
I work on these things. All right. Well, as we all learned dramatically when Roland Burris was turned away at the Senate door not that long ago, any senator-elect needs an election certificate in order to be seated. And the state Supreme Court has ruled that an election certificate could be ordered once the state courts have finally decided the election contest. So I have to ask you, if Mr. Coleman appeals to the state Supreme Court, and then the state Supreme Court rules that one of these two men have won the election, you will sign an election certificate then, won't you?
Well, it's premature to say that, Rachel, based on a number of factors. And the factors include this. Number one, the state court could hold in abeyance or stay, in legal terminology, its own decision for a period of time to allow for a federal appeal. I don't know that they'll do that, but they might. The federal courts, if they accept the case, might stay the state court proceedings. And we also want to have a chance to see what the case would look like at that point in terms of how harshly or strongly the issues have been decided or dealt with by the Minnesota Supreme Court. Keep in mind, Norm Coleman could also win that appeal, so this issue could be turned around on Al Franken pretty summarily if it goes that direction.
Mr. Coleman is the one, though, who has talked about potentially filing a federal lawsuit if and when the state result is not to his liking. And if that would be the action, that federal lawsuit, if that would be the action that would prevent you from signing the election certificate, which would have the effect of keeping Minnesota from having full representation in the Senate, that makes that federal court case really important. So I have to ask if you think that Norm Coleman's rights have been violated in this state process so far, if you think the state process has gone wrong somehow.
Well, in fairness to Norm Coleman, I've heard him say only that he hasn't opened or closed any options in that regard. He hasn't finally decided what he would do. So I want to be fair to him and accurate in that regard. Number two, we just need more information as to evaluating this case. The nutshell version of it is this. Some counties took a very strict view of what absentee ballots should be counted under the strict requirements of our laws. Others were more lax about it. So it raises an equal protection argument, whether rights were exercised or respected differently in different counties. And then Senator Coleman, I think, has some concerns about the procedures of the district court process as well.
And you think those things might not be adequately resolved by your state court?
Well, I think the state court will do a good job and a fine job, but there are some equal protection issues that are federal equal protection issues. And again, don't want to get ahead of ourselves because I'm not even sure one or the other party is actually going to get to federal court, whether the state court or the federal court may hold this in abeyance for a while, how strong the case even looks at that point. So that's something that all has to be evaluated when we get to that point, and I will evaluate it genuinely and seriously at that point. But it's really quite unfair to say, what will you do in advance of all of that?
I guess there's a principle. There's two sort of principled issues here, and one is whether or not you think Minnesota is capable of deciding this at the state level, or whether this ought to be a federal case. And certainly that's a legal matter, but it's also a principled matter. The other issue is how much of a sense of urgency you feel like there is that Minnesota needs a second senator. I understand that it's possible that these things could play out for months or for years. The head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee has sort of been rubbing his hands in glee, saying it might take years. At least that's how it seemed to me when I've seen John Cornyn talk about it. Do you have a sense of urgency about this?
Well, of course, it puts Minnesota at a disadvantage to have one less member of Congress, but two things to be balanced against each other. One is the frustration and the need to have a full congressional delegation, and the other is making sure we have confidence in the integrity of our elections. Those things have to be in balance. A few more weeks or months will be frustrating, but it's important that we also maintain the integrity of our elections. And if I might, Rachel, just quickly, you talked earlier about issues of significance. The Minnesota Supreme Court, in an earlier decision in this very case, said we're not going to count absentee ballots at one point in the process unless both campaigns agree to allow them in. Now, I respect our Minnesota Supreme Court, but since when does somebody's constitutional right to vote depend on two campaigns agreeing? That's a constitutional right and principle that rises or falls on its own merit, not whether two political campaigns agree. So that's an example of the kind of things that a higher court may have to look at and say, was that correct? So it troubles me. It concerns me. That
would sound to me like an effort by the court to try to meet both prerogatives here, the prerogative of justice and the prerogative of getting this done so that the people of Minnesota are represented, to try to find a ground where everybody feels like at least the process they got a fair shot. Governor Pawlenty of Minnesota.
Yes, but how would you feel, Rachel, if somebody said your right to vote depends on whether the Bush campaign and the Gore campaign can agree on it? That's not how it works. That's not how it should work.
I would feel just as mad as if I heard the head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee gleefully exclaiming about how he hoped this took years to resolve, almost holding the representation of the people of Minnesota in the United States Senate hostage so that the Republicans can keep one more likely Democratic vote out of the Senate. I would be mad in either count, and you're sort of put in the middle of this. And as a member of the Republican Party and as the chief executive of the state of Minnesota, you've got those competing prerogatives that are going to be pushing you in both directions on this too, I imagine.
I understand. That's all true, but that's why I get paid the big money here in Minnesota.
Governor Pawlenty of Minnesota, you're a good sport. Thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate it.
Happy to do it. Thank you.
It is Passover.